You know, many of us have walked through the halls of these grand historic museums, right? We look at artifacts from worlds away, from centuries ago. But what if I told you that for a very long time, some of the most famous collections in the country held a deeply disturbing secret? The remains of hundreds of thousands of Native American people. So today, we're going to dive into this difficult but incredibly important history. It's a shocking fact, isn't it? And it brings up this one central question that just demands an answer. How on earth did this happen? Why would museums, which are supposed to be places of learning and preservation, end up holding the ancestors of so many indigenous communities? Well, the answer, disturbingly enough, doesn't start with pure, simple evil. It actually begins under the banner of science. To really understand the why, we have to go back to the 19th century and a pretty twisted pursuit that was all about measuring skulls. Okay, so at the time, there was this fierce debate raging in the scientific world. On one side, you had the monogenists. They believed everyone came from a single creation, a shared ancestry. They argued that any racial differences we see were just because of the environment. But on the other side, you had the polygenists, and their idea was totally different. They claimed that different races were created separately, and that physical traits like the shape of your skull were permanent proof of these different origins, and, of course, different abilities. And this is where it gets really, really dark. The main tool for the polygenists was this new, so-called science called craniology. The whole idea was that by measuring skulls, you could figure out a person's intelligence, their personality, their whole character. But let's be real, this science was rigged from the start. It was designed to produce one specific result, a racial hierarchy that, surprise, surprise, put white Europeans right at the top. The guy who really ran with this in America was a physician named Samuel G. Morton. He's often called the founder of American physical anthropology. And he became completely obsessed with proving this racial hierarchy. And to do that, he needed data, or what he called data. He needed skulls, lots of them. He ended up building a collection of over 1,000 human skulls. And you can see this academic demand just fueling a fire. Here's a quote from a letter to Morton from a collector. He wrote, "I hope to be able to procure more skulls. It seems to me dangerous to draw general inferences from one specimen." So you see, this wasn't about finding one or two examples. The whole flawed logic of their science required them to collect on a massive scale. So what happens when you create this academic demand for human remains? Well, it ignited what you can only really call a frenzy, a great skull rush. And you can see how things just escalated so quickly on this timeline. In 1839, Morton publishes his big book, Crania Americana, and suddenly this pseudoscience becomes a legitimate field of study. Then, less than 30 years later, in 1868, it gets official. The U.S. Army Medical Museum literally issues an order for its officers to go out and collect Native American skulls. And by 1893, it's a full-blown public spectacle. Hundreds of Native American skeletons were put on display for everyone to see at the World's Fair in Chicago. The mindset of the collectors themselves was just chillingly opportunistic. Get a load of this quote from a letter someone sent to Morton about a tribe that was suffering from a disease epidemic. There is an epidemic raging among them. I don't rejoice in the prospects of death, but then you know it will be very convenient for my purposes. I mean, wow. A human tragedy was seen as nothing more than a convenient opportunity for science. And they got these remains from everywhere, with absolutely no regard for human dignity or sacred traditions. They were taken from battlefields, sometimes right after a conflict ended. Collectors literally dug up fresh graves. They stole from burial platforms, took bodies of patients who died in army hospitals, and plundered sacred ancestral burial caves. The scale of the desecration is just immense. And I really want to stress this point. This wasn't just a few rogue individuals. This was official. That 1868 order from the Army Medical Museum wasn't a friendly suggestion. It was a directive. And it resulted in over 4,000 Native American remains being shipped to Washington, D.C., a lot of them taken by force. This was a systematic, government-sanctioned operation. You know, this whole thing was never just about bones and bad science. This collection campaign inflicted a deep, lasting trauma on Native American communities, a legacy of harm that, honestly, continues to this day. And to really get the depth of that harm, you have to understand the beliefs of the people who were victimized. For so many tribes, ancestors and their resting places are sacred. This historical account says it all. The violation of the grave was always regarded as an offense of the first magnitude and provoked severe revenge. What the collectors were doing was a profound spiritual assault. And if you want to put a human face on this cruelty, there's the story of a young Inuit boy named Minnick. An explorer brought him, his father, and 4 others to a museum in New York. When his father got sick and died, the museum staged a fake funeral, a burial with a log in a coffin, just to trick the boy. Then they secretly had his father's skeleton cleaned and put it up on display. Years later, a teenage Minnick discovered his own father's bones in a museum case. He begged them to return his father for a proper burial, and the museum refused. This quote from a doctor at Columbia University about the remains of an 11-year-old Inuit girl, it just perfectly captures the dehumanization at the heart of all this. We think the body of the girl will be an interesting study. We can do what we please with it. These weren't people. They were objects. They were specimens. But the story doesn't end there. The fight for justice and the long, difficult journey to bring these ancestors home, that's the modern chapter of this history. It's about repatriation and it's about reckoning. So, starting in the 1960s, a new wave of Native American activism started to build. Leaders began speaking out loudly, demanding that museums and other institutions return their ancestors so they could finally be reburied with the dignity and traditions they had been denied for so long. And all that activism led to a truly landmark piece of legislation in 1990. It's called NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Basically, this law created a legal process that requires any institution that gets federal money to return human remains and important cultural items to their direct descendants and affiliated tribes. It was a game changer. So what does this look like in the real world? This slide shows data from just one institution, the Burke Museum in Seattle. As of April 2024, just look at these numbers. Over 570 ancestors returned home, and nearly 25,000 funerary objects sent back to their communities. It really just shows you the staggering scale of what was taken in the first place. Let's just focus on that one number for a second. 573. That's not a statistic. That's 573 individual people, 573 ancestors returned from a single museum. Each one of those represents a family, a community, a story. And this incredibly important work is still happening at institutions all across the country. This journey of repatriation, it's a huge step toward healing a very deep historical wound. But it leaves us all with a really critical question to think about, one that goes way beyond just returning bones. What is truly owed to the people whose ancestors were stolen, studied, and displayed like they were nothing more than scientific curiosities?